Hi guys, this is Supernova TCG with my Smoker deck profile that I took to our store championships and went 4-1, only losing in the last round. I've been playing black since OP02. Going into OP03, I had a very refined Rob Lucci list that I was very happy with. However, with the restrictions to the red cards and people expecting Whitebeard not to be played, I felt that Smoker was the correct leader to play. Smoker has a slightly better matchup against Zoro, Law, and Katakuri, which is why I decided to go with Smoker as opposed to Lucci. Disclaimer, I did play against 5 black decks in our tournament, 4 Luccis and 1 Smoker mirror. I know that's not a good sample size against the meta. However, I was not confident with taking Smoker to begin with, or black in general. I could not really find a good balance between the red decks and the yellow decks. However, I decided to play Smoker because I was most comfortable with the list, and that's what I would recommend to others. You should play the deck that you're most comfortable with, and just make sure you're teching for the correct matchups. With that being said, the first character is Suru. Suru is a 2k counter. It's typically the last 2k counter that I discard because it only costs 1. It's a very good combination with your KO characters like Sakazuki. Utilizing 2 Surus at the end of the game, along with your Smoker ability, you're able to kill 10 drops. The yellow game plan is to play back-to-back Big Moms. Killing one of them could win you the game. The next 2k counter is Monkey D. Garp. Monkey D. Garp was not originally in my list. I was playing Khalifa because of the ability to -2 once again like Suru and the ability to cycle through the deck. But with Zoro and Law being expected to be more prominent, I decided that the combination of Garp in combination with Smoker was a good game plan to go into the red decks. Garp does get killed by Vista, Marco, and Robin. If they're playing those characters on curve in the early of the game, they're not swarming out, and they're not getting the card advantage that red typically gets. So you're okay with them doing that because if they're going to curve out, your curve is stronger than theirs. That's the reason why I decided to play Garp, and then if you're able to swing with him in combination with your Smoker ability, you're just getting a lot of value. The next 2k is Tashigi. Tashigi is a pseudo Suru, but it does have its advantages, being a body that you can play. It is 4k attack, so it does dodge the Vista, Marco, and Robin, as I was saying earlier, that have been pretty prominent. I know these cards do die to Fire Fist, which is the other prominent event card you should expect. However, if they're spending their turn to play those cards, once again, they're not developing characters on the board, and you being a board-centric deck, you're okay with them doing that. If they're gonna use their events to get rid of these weenie characters, you're perfectly fine with that. 2Ks being able to be played against Zoro, against Law to contest the board is important because it makes it so that they're very useful. They can contest the board as well as be used as a 2K, which is their intended purpose in the decks to begin with. The next character is Brand New. Brand New is the searcher of the deck. Being a 3k body is pretty useful, especially against Zoro, even against some of the other decks that are mid-game centric, because he only needs 2 Don to attack, which is not that crazy of an investment. A lot of the other searchers require 3 Don in order to attack, and that's a pretty steep price, so that's why typically those characters never attack. They just stay on the board forever. To me, the way that black is set up, it seems that powerful deck, but like less consistent. The next card is Fukuro. Fukuro is a mini Borsellino. It's the new OP03 card that we got, and Borsellino is the best card in the deck, in my opinion. So a mini Borsellino has to be pretty good, right? Fukuro is really good because you can play it early. You can contest the board. You can play him early and just sit there, and then not many decks have a way to out him because he cannot be KO'd. So he's definitely blocking something, and the blockers are very important in black because you're slowly losing resources based on the way that your deck plays, and Fukuro being able to block a big attack is very valuable. The next card is 4 copies of Kobe. I personally like a lot of removal in my deck. I know that some people might be cutting this card, right? Because It only hits 3 cost characters, so if you look at maybe Zoro, right, the card that you really want to hit is like maybe Robin or their Rush Zoro. Pretty good against yellow, and he is decent against red. It's not like he's a horrible character against red. He's pretty good against yellow, especially combined with Smoker, because yellow, in order for them to contest the mid game, is they really rely on their triggers. And combined with Smoker, their triggers are typically 4 cost. You cannot stop them from triggering their characters. However, you can save a card like Kobe back, so they do trigger a card like Cracker. You have an answer to their trigger. I played against 5 black decks, so Kobe ended up being subpar against those matchups. One thing that you can do with Kobe is combine him with your minusing abilities, and then it extends the reach of Kobe. On the day, he was essentially just a 1k counter. There is arguments to cut him. That is something that I might do, depending on how the meta shapes up. The next card is 4 copies of Borsellino. This card definitely, in my opinion, I don't even think it's debatable, is the strongest card in the deck. This character not being able to be KO'd, probably as the game progresses, there'll be more ways to handle him, but currently there's not many ways to get rid of him, so he just stays on the board and is a very powerful blocker. And he puts pressure on your opponent. One thing that I did against all of my matchups, which some of my opponents were a little surprised by, is that when I played Borsellino, I attacked with him. They were just so surprised, like, oh, why are you attacking with Borsellino? Black has a very strong mid game, and because your early game characters you're playing are not really doing much, you're only playing them against Zoro to contest the board. So it's really important that when you play your first mid-game character outside certain situations, you want to be attacking. You need to be putting pressure, taking over the mid-game until you really need to block with Borsellino, right? So basically, if you don't need to block with him, you want to attack. When you attack with him, your opponent, because there's not really good ways in the game to get rid of him, they're going to attack him anyway. So it's essentially served as a blocker anyway, but you got to attack also. And then that is how you're supposed to play Black, because Black wins by getting small advantages, right? And one of the small advantages you can get is by attacking with your characters, getting a card out of your opponent's hand, or taking a life, right? And then when they attack back, right, you can defend them. And then next turn, you're going to attack again. It being a 6k body on your opponent's turn is important because it's a lot easier to defend than your 5k leader. Next character is 4 copies of Kuzan. Kuzan is also one of the very strong cards in the deck. First thing it does is that when you play him, he replaces himself. You draw a card, which a lot of your characters, like the KO abilities, they make you discard cards in your hand. A lot of the black cards make you discard, right? Like the KO abilities. I'm playing a very heavy removal, so I have a lot of those characters in this deck. It's important that this card draws a card, because you get to play it, right? And then you're not afraid if your opponent removes it. And then your opponent wants to remove it because he is a engine by himself. He minuses for whenever he attacks, and then it puts a lot of characters that your opponent is gonna play into range of your removal. And that's how you win the game. A lot of decks want to get rid of Kuzan as soon as possible, because the longer he stays on the board, the more value he's gonna get. The next card is 4 copies of Hina. This is the character that I replaced the 2k for. I wanted, like I was saying earlier, I wanted to play 16 2ks. However, I felt that Hina, being very good against Zoro, was worth to include, because some of the Zoro lists are playing this very hyper-aggressive list, and that makes it so that you need to be able to fend off their attacks. And Hina's very good at that, because he blocks 2 attackers that your opponent is going to attack with. Because that list doesn't play any defense, once you block with it, they're a lot easier to kill. Obviously, it didn't play any red, but it's also, because of the 6k body, it's also pretty good against other matchups. The next card is 2 copies of Monkey D. Garp. I wanted to play more. However, I decided the Kobe's and other slots were needed more than Garp. Garp is one of my favorite cards in Black, because for me, I see him as the 5th and 6th copy of Sakazuki, which is a really strong card in the deck. The way that Black is positioned is that it has very powerful effects, but you don't always see them because it's the last consistent deck. It doesn't have a lot of search like the other colors have. So when you build, sometimes you need to have multiple copies of of a card, even though maybe it has a slightly worse ability, it makes it so that your deck is more consistent overall. That's why some Fukuro becomes a very good card in the deck, because it's a mini Borsellino. It doesn't serve exactly the same purpose, but having more blockers in the deck in general, because you're slowly losing resources, the blockers are the cards that will give you more and more resources. So Garp is, like I said, a 5th and 6th copy of Sakazuki. But one thing he does that's pretty decent is that when he uses his ability, he taps. And then some people are like, oh, that's a bad thing. Why do you think that's a good thing? Because when you tap him, now all of a sudden your opponent's attacks are going to Garp, as opposed to your leader. Because your early game cards are not really putting any threat onto your opponent, a lot of the attacks in the beginning of the game are going to your face. So you're gonna be at like 2 or 3 life by the time you're playing Garp. And it's really good that he taps himself, is that he defends your life. Because the black deck in general, you want to be kind of maintained at 2 or 3 life, because later in the game your opponent is going to be attacking for bigger numbers. And because this deck naturally loses cards in their hand, you're not going to be able to block those big attacks. That's why you want to be blocking when your opponent attacks for 5 or attacks for 6. Countering out of those with 1 card is really, really important. And then so it makes it so that later in the game when your opponent is attacking for like 9k, okay, you'd be like, I just take it. Garp is really good at that, and also because he's a 6k body, and your opponent attacking Garp instead of your leader, he's a lot easier to defend as well. The next card is 4 copies of Sakazuki. Sakazuki is one of the stronger finishers in the deck, essentially. He is a removal, and don't ignore his 7k stat line, because that stat line is very important for you winning the game. Typically, when you play Sakazuki, he's one of the cards that you want on the board at the end of the game in order to win. The way this deck wins is that you want to have 3 to 4 characters on the board that you can attack with. Those characters are going to be characters like Sakazuki, Borsellino, Kuzan, Hina, sometimes Garp, and you want to set your opponent down. At the beginning of the game, you're whittling your opponent's resources. Maybe you're poking them, maybe they'll be at like 3 life. And the way you're going to push your game is that your opponent being at 3 life, you can swing 2 times, put them at 1 to 0 life, and then you're going to force your opponent to try to go for game. That's why characters like Sakazuki are important, because he doesn't require any Dawn. He can attack for bigger numbers. He's big enough over your opponent's leader that he's going to put enough pressure. That's why sometimes it's really good to play him on curve without even using his ability, because the 7,000 attack is pretty oppressive to your opponent. The next card is 2 copies of Isho. Whitebeard, supposedly going into this tournament, not going to be in the meta. Isho becomes less important. It's really only good against Law or Katakuri. However, his -3 ability is relevant. Sometimes it doesn't feel good to play him without trashing 2 cards from your opponent's hand. However, you do need bodies in this deck, and the Isho is still a pretty powerful card. Having him at 2, I felt like was still pretty good, and he's still pretty good against yellow. That's the reason why I decided to include him. Next up is the 2 copies of the 10 cost Kuzan. This card I have kind of a love-hate relationship with. I ended up putting him in this time after not including him for the past few weeks because of the situations where yellow is just too oppressive with their late game. My original game plan against yellow is to have a strong board going into their Big Mom turn. If they're going to play Big Mom, you want to punish them and then really pressure the life in that type of situation. But sometimes you get into this tied board state where Kuzan comes in handy. However, you can't just look at the good parts of a card, you have to look at the negative things, right? Which is when I look at all the cards in my list, I don't only look at what they're good at, I look at like what matchups are they really bad at. And then Kuzan sometimes is a really win more type of card. I played against 5 black decks, and even in that matchup where it's arguably pretty decent in, of course they have Borsellino and some cards that can't be KO'd, but it's still a pretty decent card in that matchup. I felt like it was not necessary. I think going forward I might cut this card. I have to look at the metagame. Whitebeard appears to be a deck that is still relevant, I really have to look at tech cards that I've chosen, right, and to see if they really fit into the metagame that I had predicted going into the tournament, which I didn't really get a chance to test against because I played against 5 black decks. But Busan was in there for those tight matchups where your opponent has a big board, you have a big board, right? Busan typically puts the matchup in your favor in those type of situations, but not really necessary, which is why I might consider cutting him. The last card is 4 copies of Shockwave. This card is really necessary in a metagame where Zoro and Law are dominant. Sometimes you don't have a play to play on your first turn if you're going second, on the 2-Don turn, your 3-Don turn, and leaving the Shockwave up and using it on that turn is pretty efficient. Because going into the mid game, you're going to be tapping out a lot because your characters, they cost 4, 5, 6 Don, and you don't necessarily have the Don available to leave it up. So Shockwave is very good in the early game and it's very good in the late game. Not as good in the mid game because you can't leave it up. However, because you want to see it early, you need to play 4 copies. It's very, very good when you hit it, and it's pretty decent out of trigger, in some matchups, right? Or in some matchups, even if it's in the trigger, you want to put it to your hand so you can use the ability, get kind of a 2-for-1 value out of it. Now let's look at the cards that are possible includes for the future. Going into the tournament, the other Smoker player that I played against, right, he was playing this 5-drop Smoker, right, as well as Help OM. And I knew Help OM as a counter to Zoro previously. The thing I don't like about this Help OM is that he's not a really good character to play on 3. He's very good if you play him for free with Trigger, but he's not as good as a 3-Don play. One, because he's 3k bodies that die to Robin, Vista, and Marco. Especially going into Marco, right? You play this on 3, right? And your opponent just plays Marco to kill it on the following turn, or even Vista on the following turn. It just doesn't feel right. Another inclusion that you can play is the 3-drop Smoker. This card, right, kind of similar to the Help OM. The reason why you play them is that you play them against Zoro and then maybe play against Law. But these cards are not very good in other matchups. And that's what I really look at when I'm deciding if I'm going to play cards, is that how bad are these against other matchups? And then I feel like these cards are really not that great in other matchups. That is the reason why I personally don't think I would include them. I had tested them out before, and they are good in the matchups they're good against, but I don't see them being good in other matchups. Other cards to consider, right, that I might think, right, I saw somebody playing Sengoku, and they're playing Sengoku over the Suru, 1-drop Suru. And it kind of made sense to me because it's also a 2k, right, but it's a body that you can play against Zoro to make your deck more consistent. As I was saying earlier, black it's not really a consistent deck. And the way that you can make it consistent is that when you have 8, 12 copies of a card that does a similar thing. And that way you're going to see one of them because there's 12 copies or 8 copies in your deck. So Goku is something I would really try, especially over the Suru. I think it makes sense in my mind, because especially if Zoro's going to run rampant, you do want to have the bodies to contest the board. Now, Help OM was a character that my friend was playing in his Smoker list in OP02. What's really good about this is the -3 ability, right? So even though this is a 1k counter, it's a 2-drop that minuses 3, right? So it has an even further reach in order to combine with your Kobes or your Garps or your Sakazukis. If I were to play Help OM, I think I would consider over Kobe. I know that this character also has 3k, like I was saying about this Help OM and this other Smoker. But because it's a 2-drop, I think it's more worth the slot, because these cards can be played on odds and evens, right? If you get evens, right, which is your preferred curve that you want to go, in some cases, probably Zoro you want to go first, take away their attack. But it doesn't matter if you're going evens or odds. This can be played on the 2-Don turn, or it can also be played on the 3-Don turn. So it's more flexible in the matchups where you don't need a body. It can still be used as a -3. And this is something I probably would test out. In theory, it's pretty good, especially if you think that you don't need the Kobes. Because like I said, Kobe is kind of like good in certain matchups, but in other matchups it's pretty not good. This is a more well-rounded card. Khalifa, I would really consider, right, once again in the same slot over the Kobe's, because I would want to try 16 2Ks. Obviously, in this deck, there's a lot of bricks. A lot of your top end don't have counter, and then what had happened, like I said in my last round, is that I didn't have counter in my hand. And Khalifa would have been good to play to cycle through those dead cards. Or sometimes you have too many of a cards, right? And it's also a body that you can play. Obviously it's for Dawn, so you don't really necessarily want to play it, but it is something that you can play. It does reach 7 drops combined with Sakazuki, and I just think the cycling ability, right, it does come in handy sometimes. And then I would really just want it just to increase the 2K count. Smoker is obviously something that is very good against Zoro. It's very good against pressuring against Zoro. Obviously that's why my opponent that was playing the Smoker played this, but typically you play this over Garp. The thing that I really like about Garp is that at worst he's a 5th and 6th copy of Sakazuki, and obviously he does more stuff like that, and I just have really found Garp to be very, very useful on offense and defense. I know he's 1K smaller, but he also can put pressure. Smoker is obviously very, puts a lot of pressure on opponents, right? Especially when he's able to get the 0. But the way I see it is that this card is only good against Zoro and Law. And so personally, black in general, it's really about your personal playstyle. I like to have heavy removal, which is, why I would go for the Garp. I think there's an argument for any of these cards. I think it's just basically your preferred playstyle. That being said, Smoker versus Rob Lucci. I think Smoker right now is better into the metagame. Rob Lucci is definitely the stronger leader. Not by much, but it's definitely the stronger leader. And I was on Lucci, especially with Whitebeard running around. And then since Whitebeard is still existent, there still might be a case to play the Rob Lucci. However, right now, looking at the metagame, I think I'm going to stick with the Smoker. If I went back to Rob Lucci, I think I would be going back to my previous build, which was a Navy build that used a CP9 package, was not using like a heavy CP9 engine. I'm not a very big fan of the CP9 engine. That's because the CP9 engine, first of all, it doesn't really have a good yellow matchup. The way that they really contest the board is through their triggers, and then because they have so many of them, you have to expect that they're going to trigger. That's just the way the deck plays, and what you can do to prepare for it is to make sure that you're anticipating when the trigger comes out. The CP9 deck does not really have a good way to answer, for example, a Cracker Out of Life, without already having established bodies. Another reason why I don't really like the CP9 deck is that the CP9 engine has a very heavy investment, and you can't just play the strong characters for it. If you play the strong characters, right, and do kind of like a greedy, like Navy CP9 deck, your deck is really lacking in consistency, and then you can high roll your opponent. However, black already is a non-consistent deck, and by adding the CP9 engine into a Navy build, you're making it so that you have to high roll your opponent even more. I did try the CP9 engine to begin with, and I really did not like Air Door. If I was going to play the CP9 engine, I don't think I would play that card. When it hits, it's very, very powerful, but when it misses, it's a waste of a card. The trigger for Air Door is pretty strong, but Air Door itself, I've just not really been a fan of the card. I even tried a heavy CP9 deck where you really cut down on the Navy cards that you're playing. You're playing like the vanillas, right? In order to really, really make your deck as consistent as possible. When I was playing that deck, there was even a game, obviously it doesn't happen all the time, but I think the fact that it can happen is enough reason to maybe not consider it. I played Air Door down, whiffed on everything except for Spandam. Summoned the Spandam, go 3 more cards deep, and I whiffed on the Spandam. Having the possibility for that to happen, and you just losing because of it, Air Door is a card that you want to play, right? If you're playing, you're not going to keep it in your hand, you have to play it. And then you playing it and that series of events happening and losing you the game just because of that is really the reason why I really don't like the CP9 engine. So if I were to play Rob Lucci, very likely stick with the Navy variant of it. Pros and cons behind is Rob Lucci better or Smoker better in the particular metagame, right? You know, the core of the deck is gonna stay very similar. You just have to look at what are the popular decks that you're gonna go against. Right now, we're expecting there to be a heavy Zoro and Law. In the recent regional, Whitebeard actually did pretty well, so we can expect that not to go away. And then with that type of scenario, Rob Lucci might be able to come back into the limelight. That being said, thank you for listening to the profile. If you have any questions, leave them down in the comments.